This week's module is about the different traditions and customs of the host countries that we've been living in, particularly how they've interacted with the process of globalization and changed over time. This is particularly relevant to students who are taking this course since we ourselves, our presence in the countries, are already a result of the process of globalization. The process of globalization is a large and broad social process to begin with. Our One of the authors, Pieters, particularly hones in on the polarizing descriptions of globalization that are dominant in American culture. Particularly, globalization is often seen as a form of westernization or modernization. Both of these imply a hierarchy of cultures. One explicitly in westernization, implying that the Western countries have a dominant culture that is subsuming the other cultures in the globe, and the other implicitly in implying that there's a single modern culture that the world is building towards in the modern era. However, he finds fault with both of these and suggests a different model of understanding the the way that globalization occurs in the modern era, which is the idea of interculturalization. Particularly, he suggests that interculturalization does not separate cultures by trying to distill a pure version of them and setting them into opposition and domination, but, but presents a system of cultures in which no culture exists isolated and each culture influences and builds each other. The example of how this process occurs is from the module is the example of the modern discussion on bullfighting. Bullfighting is a practice and a huge part of Spanish culture. Ernest Hemingway's paper in the Toronto Star does not explicitly debate the morality of bullfighting, but rather presents it as a beautiful Spanish tradition which depicts a struggle between man and beast, the tragedy being the dominance of the man over the beast. However, as time has gone on, even in the last 100 years, the modern perception of bullfighting has changed. A recent video on bullfighting that was part of the module depicts how the process of bullfighting, but in a similarly to how Ernest Hemingway tried to describe it in his words 100 years ago. However, in the video, it depicts it and focuses on the violence and implicitly seems to condemn it. Another video shows a modern discussion on the practice of bullfighting, and particularly sets in opposition two groups and two cultural hubs of Spain. One who believe that bullfighting is outdated and a blood sport, and the other who believes that it's an important part of their tradition. However, I think that in this you can see already the process of interculturalization. I think it's clearly Ernest Hemingway himself is an example of how Western countries were, or how a more dominant Western country was able to be influenced by a less dominant Western culture, and his view on how bullfighting was such a beautiful thing. But modern groups that originate in America, such as the Animal Rights Protection Agency, have begun to influence Spanish thought. But the core of it all is the respect for the animal, the bull. And so I think in this there you see the unity of culture and how though it seems to be an opposition of two groups, the pro bull rights group and the pro bullfighting group, the motive and the process is something where the two groups are, rather than one dominating the other, have influenced and built each other up over the years. In Canada, one of these events that I've been to is the local Brazil Festival. The local Brazil Festival is a relatively recent occurrence. It began 13 years ago, and it reflects the increase in the 1980s and 19 of younger Brazilian families moving into Toronto. Particularly in the early 2000s, these families have begun purchasing and renting housing in a higher proportion within the area of Little Portugal. This directly coincides with the start of the festival, and the festival itself is a means of the Brazilian community in the area gathering together and having being able to celebrate their culture. I think that I think that it's interesting that this festival is already the result of globalization. It's too young to have it's too young to examine the change over the years, but I think it's entirely possible to compare it to other festivals in the Toronto region and also to compare it to traditional Brazilian festivals. And really it's neither of which. It Being at the festival myself and talking to the people there, most of the people felt like it didn't feel like a little piece of Brazil was brought to Toronto. However, it's distinct from from pre-existing Toronto traditions, and I think it represents a already the mixing ground for for the Brazilians in Toronto trying to find their community and their identity in ways that are neither Canadian and neither Brazilian. All of the signs were in English, and the MC spoke bilingually during the event. And I think it represents rather than the and I think it represents the point of this module quite beautifully in that it's neither the dominance of Brazilian culture existing or a pocket of it existing in a dominant surrounding Canadian culture, and neither is a Canadian culture subsuming and and ultimately overcoming Brazilian culture in their group, but it's them trying to understand their in between status as a new community in Toronto, as well as recent immigrants from Brazil. Thank you.